I'm joined now by David Hunt. David's the president and CEO of PGIM, which manages $1.2 trillion in assets. David, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Devin.
So the theme of this year's Milken Institute Global Conference is driving shared prosperity. What role do you think your industry, the investment management industry, what role does it have in that trend?
Well, we think asset management has a critical role to play in the national discussion that we're going through right now about prosperity and about inequality. So in general, I would say that America is wealthy, but is not prosperous. And I think that we've been exploring those trends a lot here with our colleagues in asset management, and also beginning the call to action for more private sector leaders to step into this. The diagnosis of inequality is probably too narrow a lens, and I think it's important that we do set the stage right for the debate. First of all, on a global level, it's very clear that actually over the last 25 years, we've made enormous strides as a planet in fighting inequality. So 2.5 billion people have been lifted up out of poverty. 1 billion people have joined the middle class. I mean, we have 165 million people every year who join the middle class around the world. So inequality has really made huge strides, mostly by moving the bottom up. So I think it's critical that we don't, in some ways, lose the magic of that as we begin to tackle the questions of inequality that do really persist here in the United States and other developed economies.
So let's home in a bit. Here in the U.S., unemployment is quite low, but we're still seeing kind of a cap on economic mobility. There's 6.2 million unemployed, yet 7.6 million job openings. So employers are clearly struggling to fill those jobs. Why do you think that's the case?
So I think this notion that the U.S. does not feel prosperous is only in part related to the income equality gap. It's certainly an important part of it, but it's not the whole story. We think that more fundamentally, it's about a loss of hope. So economic mobility in this country is at an all-time low. We think it's about the lack of dynamism in the economy. I mean, there is the low levels of growth that we've had. Small businesses are not doing well. They're not creating jobs. So the economy itself is slow. And then most importantly is the sense of vulnerability. So 40% of Americans actually can't survive a $500 unexpected expense. And so when you take in this lack of hope, the dynamism point, and the sense of vulnerability, I think you can begin to understand why America doesn't feel as prosperous as it should.
David, you mentioned slower growth. So let's go to the $1 million question, or actually probably the $1 trillion question. What's your outlook for economic growth? And is the talk of recession, which we hear a little bit more and more of every year at this conference over the past few years, is that a real threat on the horizon?
So I think that the narrative that is dominant today is that actually we have asynchronous growth around the world. So we went through a period where we had synchronized growth, and we've certainly come to the point where we're now slowing, but it's happening in very different ways. So the United States, I would say, is actually doing fine. In fact, we believe that it's growing well above its long-term potential. Europe, on the other hand, is actually struggling. Italy is in a technical recession. You have the Brexit problems. And then, we've been very surprised at the weakness in Germany. So that for us is the flashpoint and where things are slowing maybe faster than people think. And then you have China, which obviously is the linchpin of a lot of global growth. They had a tougher year last year, which is for them is still pretty high growth rates.
Right.
But they are also stimulating their economy, and our prediction is that this year they will actually rebound. So the picture is different around the globe, but we do remain constructive on risk assets and on the outlook for the global economy, even as we worry about Europe.
So as I mentioned, you oversee the direction of $1.2 trillion in assets. What kind of investment themes and opportunities are really compelling right now, whether by geography or by sector or by asset class, as you think about your asset allocation at PGIM?
So I think that the last 6 months has been one of the best times to see the difference between long-term investors and short-term investors. So we invest for largely pension funds, large pools of institutional capital who have a 10-year, 20-year time horizon. So when we went through the fourth quarter of last year,
Right.
we actually put money to work in risk assets because we believed that the economic fundamentals were still pretty good. So we were absolutely put money into equities. We put money into high yield. We put money, importantly, into emerging markets, which we'd been wanting to do, and we got the chance because the entry point had gotten attractive. So we really stepped into that market volatility. Now you fast forward to the end of the first quarter here, and our biggest problem is everything is expensive again. And bizarrely, volatility is very low. So our biggest risk now is how do we put money to work at attractive rates if we look out over the next 10 years, given that everything's expensive?
Right. David, as I mentioned, you oversee the direction of 1.2 trillion. You also oversee 4,000 employees, and many of them investment professionals at PGIM. I want to ask you a question about the evolving skills required to be successful in investment management. Over your own career, have you seen certain skills become more important to be successful in investment management? I'll mention, for example, we hear a lot about the importance of understanding data and data science or technology as an investment professional. Is that the case at PGIM?
We do believe that technology will play more and more a role within investing and indeed within the business of asset management broadly defined. But at the end of the day, we see this as technology in the service of the judgment of professionals rather than a replacement. We think that a lot of the hype around AI probably will not come to fruition, and it turns out that it's much harder to find really stable correlations in data than people might guess. And so our sense is that people will be enabled by technology, but people are going to remain in charge of the investment process for as long as you and I are around.
Are you experimenting with AI in any way to see how much of a role it can play going forward?
We absolutely are, and I would say it's not just AI because I think that's a very specific set of capabilities, but I think we are absolutely looking at the role of alternative data sets in making decisions, and that runs everything from satellite imagery to some of the natural language processing capabilities, and we are seeing that there are some signals in these that are stable, and we are starting to incorporate them into our investment process, but again, in the service of our investment professionals rather than as a replacement.
Interesting. David, I want to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, shared prosperity, and a question from the stream. You know, we've heard from a few people like Ray Dalio, for example, about the need to redraw capitalism, to think about it in a whole different way. Is it that drastic, the change you think needs to occur, or is it more incremental?
So I think that I have a somewhat different take than Ray does on both the diagnosis and the prescription. As I mentioned before, our system of open trade and capitalism has resulted in what is in some ways the greatest uplift of economic prosperity for people around the planet that we've seen in the history of humankind. And I don't think we want to throw away the benefits of that because of specific issues that we have in a number of developed countries. That said, the U.S. economy and several others do need to change in order to share prosperity more broadly. And let me give you a specific example of that. So in the United States, we have plenty of job openings and we have some unemployed, but the skills don't match.
Right.
And that problem is only going to get worse and worse as technology moves on. So we are not producing people that have the kinds of skills that we need in our economy for the future. We need more coders, more data scientists, more nurse practitioners, and we aren't getting those out of the system. Now, corporate America has long left that to either the government or teachers or schools or vacation groups. That's no longer acceptable. corporate America and institutional investors are going to need to lean into that problem and start investing significantly in the reskilling of the American workforce so that we're ready for the future. And I think that kind of thing is a great example of where the private sector needs to step into a problem that we haven't so far. But I don't know that that's a remaking of capitalism. It's a leadership in an area that hasn't been led by the private sector.
That's a great point to end on. David, thank you for joining us.